Um, okay, welcome. I'm Anne Nichols. I'm chair of the CIPR's Education and Skills Sector Group. And I'm really thrilled to have this very illustrious panel here today to talk about how to navigate the corridors of power. Now, the first one is Chris White, who leads SCC Newgate's public affairs team, who's also been a policy advisor to several previous government ministers. We have Sora Gluck, who leads the policy work at Edge Foundation. She's a senior policy advisor. George Ryan is associate director at Public First, a consultancy firm based in Westminster. And then we have Caroline Wood, who works as a research communications manager for the University of Oxford. So I'm going to shut up now and ask each of you if you can just introduce yourselves, say what your role is and roughly the kind of things you're dealing with at the moment. So I'll start off with Chris.
Thanks very much, Anne, and pleasure to be here. So my name is Chris White. I head the advocacy practice at the corporate affairs consultancy SEC Newgate. That's a global firm of about 1,500 people that advises businesses across a huge range of sectors, from education and skills to infrastructure, energy, and professional services. My role within the organisation is twofold. So I sit on the leadership team and help devise a strategy for the UK business. But I also advise businesses on how to engage with political stakeholders in their campaigns. And as you said, for my sins, I was previously a special advisor in the Conservative-led government in the coalition between 2010 and 2015. And my role was to manage and plan the legislative programme. So I was in the Whip's office and the Leader's office for the whole 5 years of the coalition government. And I was in Westminster for about 11 years, doing a number of different roles, working for MPs as well. So I've been around the block, and hopefully I can share a few tips and tricks today.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll go on to Sora now.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah. I lead the policy work and education charity called the Edge Foundation, where I've been for the past 3 years. Prior to that, I worked for a couple of years as a parliamentary assistant to a backbench MP. So sort of like Chris, I know both sides of the coin in terms of political influencing. So Edge is a little bit different to a consultancy or agency because we do all of our research and policy work in-house. So a lot of my work revolves around turning the research that the research team does into policy recommendations and then engaging with policymakers to drive those recommendations forward. A lot of our policy work is also quite reactive. So reacting to new policy announcements like the new white paper that was published yesterday, and responding to consultations from the government and different select committees as well. In recent years, the key priority for the policy team at Edge has been apprenticeships and ensuring that there is sufficient supply of apprenticeships for young people in particular. So we do write our own policy reports to supplement the research reports that we have. We'd had 2 recent policy reports on apprenticeships for young people, and we've also just launched a new campaign to engage with policymakers and SMEs directly to encourage more small businesses to offer apprenticeships. So that's taking up a lot of my work in terms of intro, Anne. But yeah, like it's a very varied role and it can change day to day. And I'm very happy to get into that a bit more in the session.
Right, George. You're on mute.
Thank you, Anne. Yeah. So hi everyone, my name's George. I'm an Associate Director at Public First. My career, I started off in journalism, so I worked on local newspapers in Norfolk, and then I moved to the Times Educational Supplement, where I was a journalist who covered FE and skills. I then went to work for the Press Association in Parliament as a political reporter, but then I made the move into the policy and communication space, and I worked at UCAS on skills policy. Then went to the Association of Colleges to lead media relations for them. And now I'm at Public First, where I work on kind of interlinked projects around education policy and communications. I think probably one of the most interesting things that I'm working on at the moment is a piece of work called the Commission into Countering Online Conspiracies in Schools. So it's a project that's funded by the Pears Foundation, who are a charitable grant-giving organisation, but Public First runs the research and the secretariat for the commission. And essentially, we're trying to find out how best to tackle the problem of pupils accessing harmful online content around conspiracy theories and how to tackle misinformation and disinformation. So it's kind of looking at media literacy, critical thinking, and how to embed that across the curriculum, but also really focusing on how to support teachers to deal with this in the classroom, because they're really on the front line of this.
Lovely, thank you, thank you, George. Caroline.
Hello, very glad to be here. So I work as a research communications manager for the University of Oxford, and my role is to communicate via compelling stories the positive impact that Oxford research and innovation is having on people's lives and the advancement of knowledge worldwide. So I do this through pitching stories to the press, finding Oxford spokespeople to give expert commentary on topical events, and publishing content on the university's own channels, including news items, in-depth features, and opinion pieces. I also support academics with policy engagement, for instance, identifying suitable research groups to contribute to calls for evidence and reviewing any draft submissions. Previously, I've worked as a policy officer for UK research and innovation, and I was also a research fellow for a time in the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology.
Wow, lovely. Just before we go any further, I need to mention that this is going to be recorded, so anybody that misses it or wishes to hear it again can get a recording. And there is a chat box on your screen, and if you want to put in questions for the panel, we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for questions. Okay, let's go on to what are the big policy issues in education at the moment? George.
Thanks, Anne. Well, it's a very busy autumn in the education policy world. We're having a lot of big policy announcements on the way. So as Zora mentioned yesterday, we had the publication of the post-16 white paper, and I know she's going to talk a bit about the FE part of that. But we're also expecting a schools white paper, which is also going to look heavily at reforming the special educational needs and disabilities system. And we're also awaiting the publication of the curriculum and assessment review as well. So to have all of these things come together in one school term is quite a lot. The post-16 white paper has been bubbling away in the background for more than a year, with various times threatened over the past 12 months for when it might be published. So the fact that they all landed in one go, more or less, is probably more by accident than design. Just to very quickly go into some of the details of those. So on the higher education aspects of the post-16 white paper, you'll probably have seen in the news about the increase in tuition fees, the first time that they have gone up in many years, but the government is promising to index link them to inflation for the first time, so that we don't have the perennial problem for universities where fees stay static, but inflation and the costs of running a university go up, so the fee income drops in real terms. So that should go some way to supporting the sector, which is struggling a lot financially. In return for that extra funding, ministers want a lot of reassurance about quality and also linking what they are doing to national priorities, particularly around providing skilled workers for the industrial strategy growth areas. The schools white paper, I think that the main aspect of this is going to be around the SEND reform elements. Obviously, the big issue in the SEND space is the sheer cost of delivering for a growing number of young people and children with increasingly complex needs. That cost falls to local authorities, and many of them are really at the point of financial collapse because of the funding that they're putting towards SEND. So the government's looking to reform what are called education, health and care plans, which is a bit like a passport, I suppose, to access SEND provision. It details what your conditions are as a young person and child and what specific support you need, and then you can go to education providers and say, this is the support that my child needs going forwards. The main kind of teaser for that from the government is that there's going to be a lot more SEND provision in mainstream schools rather than in specialist settings. And then finally, the curriculum and assessment review, that's been led by Becky Francis. We've already had the interim report out earlier in the year, so the final piece shouldn't have too many surprises in it, but essentially the key takeaways are probably going to be around increasing breadth, particularly in the upper secondary stage. So we might see a kind of signals that the review recommends moving away from performance measures like Progress 8, for example, which many see as limiting the curriculum to a more STEM-based offer. So that's kind of it on that side. I don't know, Sora, did you want to jump in on the post-16 angle?
Yeah, of course. And as you said, it was long awaited and we just had no idea when it was actually going to come out. So it was a nice surprise getting it yesterday. So yeah, and also very neatly kind of sums up all the big issues facing the FE&N skills sector at the moment, and gives some more detail on some policy announcements that have been trailed over the past few months as well. So probably the biggest announcement of the day were the introduction of V-levels. So these are a third track of qualifications to sit alongside A-levels and T-levels, with the sort of vocational aspect there to simplify the vocational qualifications landscape. So these would essentially replace BTECs and other applied general qualifications once the funding is removed from them in 2027. There's been a lot of discussion around these V-levels and whether they're necessarily needed or whether they're just kind of rebadging existing programs. And we do still need to see a bit more detail on that, but there will be a consultation that the government has launched to input our views, which Edge will definitely be submitting to. And on top of that, there's also been other changes in terms of qualifications and curriculum pathways. The government has introduced new pathways at level 2. Is going to introduce new pathways at level 2 and so-called stepping stone qualifications for those young people who don't pass their English and maths GCSEs as well. So those will be at level 1 to kind of help them onto the pathway to passing English and maths. We also had a bit more detail on some other elements of government announcements. So, for example, the growth and skills levy, which will be replacing the apprenticeship levy, has been a big point of discussion in the skills space. And all we had known until now is that there'll be some new short courses that will be coming in April 2026 that will be funded through the levy. The white paper we hoped would give us a bit more detail, but all we have so far is that these short courses will be called apprenticeship units and will somehow relate to existing apprenticeship standards. Again, we need a lot more detail here, and we haven't gotten it. And considering these will start being rolled out in April, it's quite frustrating not having a bit more information there. Other changes that we've got are changes to FE teacher recruitment and support and training. Some very interesting proposals there in terms of industry exchanges and to make sure that FE lecturers are kept up to date with changing industry standards, which we were very happy to see at Edge because it relates to a previous program that we had called Teacher Externships, where teachers were sent to local businesses to make sure that their curriculum is up to date with the latest industry needs. So yeah, very good to see that, and very good to see a lot of our research and policy work kind of being represented in the white paper too. Other announcements included measures to target those most at risk of being not in education, employment and training, and better data collecting and tracking and sharing amongst local authorities and strategic authorities so that we can provide ultimate support to those young people. That way, providing a bit more detail on the Chancellor's announcement at Party Conference about making sure that every young person on long-term benefits is guaranteed a work placement. So that was quite useful to see that too. And overall, it's a very packed paper, and I had the pleasure of reading it all in 2 hours this morning. And I'll put a link to our policy response on the website if that's helpful, if anyone wants to dig into the detail there.
Wow, I'm exhausted. No, there's just awful lot going on. I think we'll move on now to a sort of general question, which is how on earth do you get the attention of MPs, lords, civil servants? You know, and who are the people that you really need to target? I mean, is it government ministers, or are there other people like special advisors that you should be focusing on? I'm going to start here with Caroline, because you've done some research in this area.
Yes, that's right. So in February last year, I published the findings of a CIPR-funded research project I led called Communicating Evidence to Policymakers, What Works Best? And one of the key aims of this was to answer precisely that question. So what channels are most effective to communicate information to policymakers? And especially if you only have limited resources, where and how should you focus your time and effort? So to answer this, I use both an online survey that was completed by about 130 different policymakers and a series of deep dive interviews. I'll put the link in the chat so you can find the full report afterwards, but top level findings showed that Google and search engines were the most common go-to information sources, with around 80% of policymakers saying they use Google nearly always or often when looking for evidence-based information. And since this research was published, of course, we've seen the exponential rise of ChatGPT and other large language models. So it's highly likely that these days, instead of turning to Google first, many policymakers are actually running those searches through ChatGPT or a different LLM instead. But I'd argue that this shift to using AI tools doesn't change the fundamental implications for communicating information to policymakers, which is publishing your information online in at least some format is a very good place to start. If it's not findable online, it's highly unlikely to get to the attention of policymakers. I also found that news outlets and mainstream media were also popular sources of information. So you may have heard the anecdote that the first thing an MP does every morning is check their social media and read the Times. So trying to get your work covered by the press, so for instance, writing press releases, pitching to journalists, is an important part of increasing awareness among policymakers. Parliamentary research services such as the Lords and Commons Libraries and the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology were also popular sources, but this was very variable. So some policymakers use these a lot, others not really much at all. So these services produce briefing papers on topical issues and ahead of debates in the chamber. So getting your research included in these briefings is a really good way to put it on the radar of policymakers, because these are issues that are on the parliamentary agenda and are being discussed. So policymakers feel they need to be informed about them. And the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology actually send out calls for experts to contribute to their upcoming briefing papers. So it's a good idea to keep an eye on their website. And I'll put the link in the chat where you can see what their upcoming work is.
Thank you, Caroline. George.
Sorry, I was just finding the unmute button. So I agree with a lot of what Caroline has said there. I think that what you've really got to do to try and get the attention of parliamentarians potentially is to think about, well, how does what I want them to think about relate to their constituents, to the public? Because ultimately that's who they are most interested in. Even peers who are unelected to some extent are mostly interested in what the public are interested in. So a way that we do that at Public First is we try to relate our research back to public opinion. So that could be in the form of polling or focus groups as a quantitative and qualitative research. And essentially our approach is by basing policy decisions on what the public cares about and what moves public opinion. That's the best way to get the attention of politicians.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, thanks very much. Look, I agree with a lot of what Caroline and George have just said. And I think I just really want to emphasize, first of all, how time poor many political stakeholders are. They've got so many competing demands vying for their attention. So whether it's the long sitting hours, the fact that they have quite a small team, actually, if you think about who actually work for them, probably only 3 or 4 people that have to deal with constituency correspondence for the 80,000 people that they represent. They've probably got 1 member of staff doing research for them. So then that's before you even take into account things like social media and things that they read in the press and so on. So getting their attention is actually quite hard. And that's why I would say that actually the messaging and the evidence base are probably the 2 most crucial points that you need to consider before you even start thinking about what channels that you need to use. So look, you can use all the channels that you want to, whether it's social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, whatever. Unless it's actually relevant, you might as well be shouting into the wind. So the most important question that I always say to businesses and organisations that we work with is, why should this MP or this parliamentarian or this government minister or SPAD care? If it's relevant to their interests, you know, their previous career, their constituency, the work of the government, then they will. If it's not, it'll just go into the delete box. So in terms of channels specifically, I think traditional engagement still works, one-to-one meetings, mass letter writing campaigns, select committees, all of that still works. But I think one thing that we're increasingly finding is that MPs are really much more tech savvy, particularly the new intake post 2024, and certainly since 2019. So we're finding a blend of what I would call traditional and new media techniques are becoming really, really interesting in how we approach things. And that's something that we're taking on board and doing. A really good example of this is a campaign we've literally just finished where we ran a campaign in the energy sector on zonal pricing. I won't bore you with the details. Suffice to say that I think what we did was we achieved a successful outcome because we did a whole raft of different things. We had the website as a library of assets. So when the MPs Google and search for things, actually they immediately find the information that they're looking for that has things like robust consumer surveys, media coverage, quotes, evidence base, and so on. We have the highly digital targeted campaigns that were search engine and AI optimized, so that when they go on Google or ChatGPT or anything like that, immediately they're finding the information that they want. Then you're putting placed adverts and op-eds in sites that the MPs that you want to read will read them. So places like New Statesman, Labour List, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever you're going. And that can be paid coverage as well, ensuring that the content is shown where the policymakers and their teams spend their time. So to just give you the final outcome of that campaign, we had what was it, something like 100,000 highly targeted impressions, 53 pieces of tier 1 or 2 media coverage, and 5,000 website visits. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think that we're only targeting specific sort of corners in the internet and people within Westminster, that's actually really high targeted numbers. And when you think about the impact of the campaign that it delivered, that definitely helped us. So you have to use now, I think, new online sources as well as you would do the traditional media.
Yep. Sora, do you want to add anything there?
I think they all covered everything I was going to say, but just to add another little practical piece of advice is, as Chris was saying, the MPs especially usually have very small teams, and they'll usually just have one researcher or parliamentary assistant, and they're very often the gatekeepers when it comes to policy emails. So that you'll have the caseworker doing the casework, but then the parliamentary researcher will cover anything policy related. So I would say copy them into any email you have, and you can usually find their email addresses in the register of MPs' interests. So that's all published online in terms of the names. And then once you know the name, you can figure out the email format pretty easily. Try to, I mean, make sure it's usually easier when you have a relationship with them to begin with. But I know in the MP's office that I used to work for, everything, we all had access to the MP's main email account, but we mainly operated out of our individual email addresses. So if you want your email to get attention, if you copy in the parliamentary assistant, it will make sure it will land in both the MP's main inbox, which is getting hundreds of emails a day, and the parliamentary assistant's inbox, which is getting far fewer emails, so it's more likely to be read.
That is really, really helpful advice. I think we'll go on to media coverage now. How important is it to get media coverage of an issue or an organisation? We're in a world now where perhaps getting in the daily, you know, I mean, Chris mentioned the Times, but getting in the daily broadsheets isn't perhaps as important as it was. But you know, I may be wrong. So George, what do you think about that? How important is media coverage?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a really good point. If you look at the analysis of where different age groups get their news from, the number of young people who engage with what we'd call mainstream media is a very, very tiny figure compared to sources like YouTube, TikTok. But that said, I think that getting that really top tier broadsheet coverage is still important for clients that I work with, particularly, and I'm sure others on this call would agree. And I think the reason for that is that the newspapers still set the agenda quite often. So although their circulations have declined, and probably overall readership has declined, as was mentioned earlier on the call, the top titans of industry, politicians, policymakers still will read, either the headlines or they'll have a paper that they read on a daily basis. You also get a lot of broadcast coverages based on the newspapers, so you'll have the evening before and often a read through of the daily papers, and the front pages still carry quite a lot of weight as well. So I would say it is still important, but I think increasingly, particularly if you're trying to engage other audiences, so more members of the public, and particularly if you're trying to engage young people, you might want to consider a broader suite of media tools, and that might be where your kind of vertical video options come in if you're thinking about TikTok or Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts.
Okay, that's interesting actually. I mean, do politicians and civil servants engage with TikTok, or is that just a way of reaching young people? Is it right? I think he's muted. Are you muted?
Oh, I
Right,
thought
yeah.
that was a rhetorical question.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Mm.
I suspect that if you were working on a campaign that you were trying to engage young people, and that level of youth engagement might then be something that caught the interests of policymakers. But I still think that the primary channels for influencing politicians and policymakers is probably the mainstream media for now. That might change.
Yeah. Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree with George's last point. Look, the grid system hasn't changed much in the sort of 10, 15 years since I've left. You know, government still has a grid where every week or sort of 2 or 3 weeks ahead, they plan out what their media strategy is for each day. And sometimes it will be a themed week, or it'll be a series of stories, and they'll plan out the top tier, the second tier stories, and so on and so forth. So having control of that grid from a government's point of view is actually really, really important, because they want to set the agenda. They don't want to be steered off it. So being able to understand what that is, know what it is in advance, and be able to think about how you can divert government's attention sometimes in terms of wresting control of the media story and the narrative that actually can be quite useful. But I would say that media is quite a double-edged sword. So having something in the press and the broadcast can be hugely useful in raising awareness of an issue at hand, but it can also backfire spectacularly and cause the government to dig their heels in. And I've been, when I was in government, on the end of that, where huge campaigns were set off, and I sat in rooms with cabinet ministers where they were literally saying things like, well, they're all kicking off, so we must be doing something right. And to take a more recent example, I mean, take the issue of VAT on private school fees. And I'm not going to get into the debate of whether it's right or wrong. I'm just going to talk about the campaign and the narrative. So no one can deny the fact that the campaign itself was actually very successful in getting media attention, acres of broadsheet, press, media, etc. But it absolutely failed to change the government's opinion and their mind in what they were going to deliver. And to be honest, I don't actually think there was much that could have been done to change what, in my view, was quite an ideological position from the government in terms of what they were going to do. So the crucial point that I would say is you have to understand your audience. It's not just government, but also their own party and backbenchers, because government can change their minds because issues become a political problem. And that's when backbenchers, for example, complain to the Whip's office, where I used to work, or to the Prime Minister, that they're getting a significant post bag, which may be caused by the media, or when they feel that they're being made, frankly, to look silly. So going back to that school fees issue, most of the Labour backbenchers were actually in favour of the policy. So whilst they may have been getting a significant post bag and they were seeing it in the press, actually there was no political problem at all from Labour Party's point of view. And remember, they've got 180 majority in the Commons. So actually, given that most of the press attention in that case was largely in the right of centre press, actually the government was never really going to change its mind. So it's just a really good recent case study in this area, in this sector, of where you can getting significant media coverage and it gets the attention, but it doesn't actually lead to policy change. And that's why you need to think really carefully about the messaging and the avenue and what you want to achieve, as well as getting the media narrative right as well.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you. So as I mentioned previously, my research project found that media coverage and news outlets are key information sources for policymakers. So arguably this should be an integral part of policy engagement. But I also appreciate that this can be very challenging. So in my role, for instance, I get sent a lot of very technical work to promote things like quantum computing or astrophysics or batteries. And they're all very important subjects, but really challenging to sell to the press. It's a topic that's difficult to understand. There's no immediate impact on people's lives, no good visuals. So it's really difficult to get mainstream coverage beyond very niche outlets. And if that's your situation, I say don't despair, because even if you can't control whether the media will cover it, you can control what you put on your own channels, and don't underestimate the power of these to reach people. So maybe think beyond just a standard news item on your website. Could you have an opinion piece? Could you have an infographic summarizing the key findings from your work, or a short video explaining the work? So once you have these assets, then you can try and snowball them by asking partner organizations to promote them, include them in email newsletters, and so on. It may be that media coverage doesn't come at this particular moment in time, but maybe further down the line, when there's been enough follow-on work to develop a really comprehensive story, or the topics come onto the news agenda. So I'd say even if you're unlikely to get media coverage at this point, do your homework and find journalists who have a demonstrated interest in your area, send them what you do for awareness, and it may be that they want to pick it up further down the line. And also don't underestimate the power of local press. So in my institution at Oxford, every academic wants to be on the Today programme, but that's not always realistic. But you can have much more success sometimes pitching to local media, and they often have capacity to send someone along to record something in person. So for instance, we recently hosted the BBC South team at our Department of Physics to do a feature on quantum computing for a fun Science in Oxford feature.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Sora.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what Caroline and Chris were saying about your audience mattering. So it's quite difficult at Edge because most of our work is focused around further and technical education, topics that the media traditionally are not very interested in, because most of the journalists have gone through the uni higher education system. So most of the stories we get tend to be around university. For example, I was really frustrated last night when Bridget Phillipson was giving the announcement on the post-16 white paper, and my BBC News notification just says that the Secretary of State is going to give an announcement around universities. And while the tuition fee rise was a big story, I just felt like there was a lot of other things in that announcement that they could have also highlighted in that headline there. So yeah, we are in a bit of a frustrating place where it's very difficult to get media attention. But at the same time, I think it's much more important to know what policymakers themselves value. So it was really heartening to see the Prime Minister in his conference speech focus so much on colleges and skills and technical education and the value he sees on it from a very personal level, talking about his family and things like that. So if you understand politicians as people rather than just receivers of news, it's a lot easier to get through to them. So I think knowing the right people rather than trying to get through to every single policymaker is a lot easier there.
Yes, it's yeah. I mean, I know the problem. I'm having been working in PR in the FE and skills sector for many years. I mean, it's sometimes you're talking on deaf ears to journalists. It's really tough. You know, it's interested in schools and schools and universities, but FE. It's almost a blind spot. I mean, George, I don't know if you want to add anything there because you've been an FE journalist.
Yes. So I think when you're kind of working very closely in that FE space, you think, oh, these are amazing stories. Why aren't people reporting them? What's going on? And I think there is an element of, yes, politicians, journalists probably did a very academic route where they went to school, sixth form, and then university. But I think also it's about how the FE sector talks about itself. And I think that quite often FE can shoot itself in the foot a bit by talking in jargon, acronyms, making itself very confusing and complicated to the outside world. So I think whilst it's definitely the case that those in power and those at the top of journalism, might not understand the FE sector, I think sometimes there's more that we could do as a sector to make ourselves more easy to understand.
No, interesting. Let's just move on to a scenario. You might be a university, a college, an academy, trust, regulator, even a charity, and you've got an issue that you want to get into the radar of policymakers. I mean, it could be a report on skills shortages, campaign about free school meals. Chris mentioned VAT on independent schools, university for research. Now, where on earth do you start? I'm going to ask Caroline because it's something that you do all the time.
Thank you. So I would say that besides having a targeted outreach focusing on policymakers, support this with wider communication. So publishing content on your own channels, sending out a press release, pitching opinion pieces to news outlets, and so on. So use a holistic approach, which means perhaps the best place to start before doing anything else is to review all the channels and resources at your disposal and draft a really broad communication strategy. So include partners who could, for instance, share your content on LinkedIn and social media. So reaching policymakers typically comes about as part of a large effort of raising awareness in general. So when planning your content that you want to target policymakers with, first check the policy landscape. Is this an issue that is related to current parliamentary business? Are there relevant bills being debated in the chamber? what is the current news cycle, because as we've mentioned before, policymakers are being bombarded with so much information all the time, so many issues that people are trying to get onto their radar. You're more likely to get cut through if you can link it to something that is actually being discussed now. And frame your key messages in terms of the things that policymakers care about. So in my research project, a common frustration among policymakers was that they were frequently sent information that hadn't been specifically written for policymakers, but regurgitated from content that had been written for other audiences. And as has been mentioned previously, remember that policymakers are elected to represent the interests of their constituents. So think about the questions that they will have, what they will really care about. So what will be the economic implications? How will it affect people's daily lives? Highlight any local or regional links or links to wider policies such as levelling up or environmental targets. And then what are you actually asking policymakers to do? A lot of the survey respondents in my project said they're often sent information with no policy recommendations. So it wasn't really clear to them what the sender wanted them to actually do in response. And then once you're clear on your messages, your policy recommendations, synthesize this information in a format that's clear, that's concise and easy to read and accessible with those policy recommendations up front. And definitely include a executive summary with the key points that can be read in less than a minute. As we all know, policymakers are extremely busy people. And my report goes into a lot more detail on how to make information most useful for policymakers, and you can have a look at that afterwards.
Wow, a lot of very useful information there. George, have you got things that you want to add?
Yeah, so I think it's really important as an organization looking to engage the media to know what your niche is. So what is it that you and your organization can talk about that no one else can? So essentially, what is it that you're expert in? And then make that expertise relevant. So how can the issue that you're trying to raise attention about, or what the campaign that you're leading, how can you make that understood by normal people? So an example I often give when talking to clients is, how would you talk about it to someone at the pub or someone at the bus stop? And then so that will help you to formulate your messaging. And once you've done that, it's important to focus on who you want to target and then think about where you want to place it in order to target those people. So I think quite often organizations will adopt a bit of a scattergun approach to sending press releases. They'll send it to the same list of journalists each time, and they're not really curate it or think about personalizing it at all to that journalist and their interests. I think often going down an exclusive approach with a journalist can be more beneficial. You might only end up with one piece of coverage, but you might end up with a really good piece of coverage. Whereas if you go with a very broad press release, you still might end up with nothing. And I'd also pick up on Caroline's points as well. Don't forget local media. Actually, that could quite often be where your audiences are. And remember that all members of parliament are members of parliament of places, and they have local media in those places.
Lovely. Chris, you're not necessarily an education specialist, but I'm sure you've got some insights into how you can get, if you're at university, college, or public, you might be a regulator, and how on earth do you get where do you start if you've got an issue to get across to politicians?
Yeah, I think what's the phrase? When something goes wrong, often I think the phrase is, I wouldn't have started from here. And what I mean by that is that so much of the work of engagement, public affairs, media and everything relies on relationships. And these are relationships you have to build over time. And they are ones that repay the more you invest in them. So, for example, if you are trying to get something into the media or get something for an MP to care about, just ringing them up when something suddenly goes wrong and expecting them to do something when you've not actually then put the time and effort in, invested it into building that relationship, inviting them along to your organization or to a site to show the work that you do. They just don't understand, and they won't, or as we've discussed before, they're particularly time poor. So like, if you're not doing this already, start now. Build up the relationships, get to know your local MPs, get to know the media that you care about, go to think tank events where these politicians are often speaking about, and actually build those relationships now, because the more you invest in it, the more it will repay you in the future. And then I guess the other thing I'd say is coalition building is so important. So, for example, right at this moment, right, we're 3 or 4 years away from the next election, and it seems like an eon away. That why am I even talking about the next election? Well, you're going to have to look at the polls to see where things are. So, what does it mean? Well, don't just assume that you need to focus on Labour right now. Actually, build the relationships with opposition parties. Even frankly, have to start thinking about engaging with parties like Reform, who don't have many MPs in the House, but who are obviously doing extremely well and are likely to win seats in the sort of national elections in Wales and Scotland next year. So all of these things, you need to think months and years ahead. And the more you do that, the more it'll repay you when you actually need their intervention and help.
That's lovely. I mean, you've answered my last question, Rich, which is the best piece of advice you can give to someone wanting to get to the ear of policymakers, and what should you not do? Now, Chris, you've answered that very succinctly, but Saura, have you got any insights into, if there was one thing that you should do and one thing that you definitely shouldn't do, an absolute no?
Probably the main thing you should do is make it as personal as possible. So make sure you make it clear that you have researched them, what their interests are, how it relates to the aims of their party, how it relates to the aims of the government and the wider government agenda. Think about what research what they've said previously. So Hansard is always a very good resource there. Look on their website. If you've met them previously, make sure that you make that clear at the top of the email. If you know people around them, make sure that you clarify that early on, just to make sure that your email stands out and is clear. Again, links to local issues, as George said earlier, are very, very important. Because at the core they're constituency representatives, so they need to make sure that they're always thinking about the next election and what they're going to say to their constituents when they're door knocking next. So if you can have some kind of link to that and give them something that to pass on to their constituents, that's always very helpful. What not to do is don't contact anyone on LinkedIn. They hate that. Any parliamentary assistants, especially, if you don't know them, don't reach out there. They get very annoyed, and understandably so. Let us keep things as professional as possible and keep to traditional forms of communications as much as possible, just to keep it as useful as possible for them.
Okay, and George and Caroline, we've got some questions coming up. So yeah, George and Caroline, if you can sum up the one thing you should do, or the one thing you shouldn't do. Start with George.
One thing you should do. So I think kind of following on from Chris's point about don't just contact people when there's something wrong. I'd say the same for journalists as well. If you've got journalists in your specialism, so presumably it will be the education journalists, but it could be business journalists or similar. Try to build some rapport with them outside of just sending them a press release. That there'll be times when this is more appropriate than others, but for the trade press, the sector press, so TES, Schools Week, suggesting that your chief executive offered to go for coffee or for lunch with them, that can be a really great way of just talking about what they're interested in covering, but also the things that you have on your agenda that you're interested in sharing as well. And it might not necessarily lead to a story instantly, but it might open the door further down the line.
And Caroline, you know, best piece of advice, anything you really shouldn't do?
I'd say perhaps the worst thing to do is just send a huge long report to a policymaker with no explanation at all as to why it's relevant. As one of my case studies in my research project said, you get sent a lot of things this way and they all end up in the pile. So if you send anything to policymakers, make sure it's actually written for them, have a cover note or an explanation saying why you're sending it, why it's relevant now. And I'd say something that you should do is include some way that they can follow up with you directly. So my project found that policymakers really value the opportunity to speak with experts directly. And there was a huge demand in particular to hear more from academics and universities, as they're viewed as impartial expert sources of information. So if you do represent a university or research institute, you already have a huge advantage in that respect. But anyone can massively improve their chances by giving policymakers the opportunity to get in touch so they can ask their questions directly. As one respondent said, I'd like fewer policy papers and more chats. So offer them a chance to have that chat, invite them for a visit or host an in-person or online briefing, just give them some way of following up with you.
Right, and that leads into, we've got about just under 10 minutes left, and some very, very long question in the chat, which is about, the first one is from Karen Westcott. It's about the SEND system, not working for children, families, schools or local authorities. It's estimated there will be a cumulative high needs deficit amongst local authorities of 5 billion by April next year. Need is outstripping funding and available provision. Given the extent of the crisis, it's going to take pretty major changes to reform the system into something that works for everyone. Right, following on from the outfall of the suggested reforms to the welfare bill in the summer, coupled with the adversarial environment around SEND, special education needs, and the financial difficulties faced by government, what are you expecting from the SEND reforms? Do you think the changes will have teeth? What will the challenges be? Phew, that's quite a long question. Very, very quick answers. Right, we'll start with George. If you can quick response.
Yeah, just a quick response there. I mean, I think that the context to view all policy changes at the moment is the fiscal climate. There's simply very little to no money at all for the government to play with. So the main reason for reforming the SEND system is to save money, and that's undoubtedly going to lead to some people feeling like they have missed out. I think the government has hinted that they would honour the EHCPs that are already in place. So that means that the people who are awaiting those or have, young children who are kind of not even in that process yet might miss out. I think there's a risk that the reforms, they talk a very big game of wanting to improve the system, but actually they just end up causing more frustration by expecting, mainstream schools to try to support pupils who potentially have needs that would be better suited for specialist provision. So it's an almighty subject for the government to try and tackle, but I think that economic context is really important.
Thanks. Chris, anything you want to add to that?
Not in particular. I just agree with the point around the extremely difficult financial climate. The government has a lot of very hard choices to make coming up at the budget, and is under a pressure from its own backbenchers on a whole raft of things like the 2-child policy limit as well. And that's to add to the fact that we borrowed significantly more during the course of this year's first 6 months of this year than was anticipated. So tax rises are coming, and that's before you add shopping lists. There always, every year, there's a special pleading from organisations. So it's extremely difficult to do something like this, but that's not to say it's not needed. And I say that as someone whose wife works as SLT in a special school.
Right. Sora, you've got anything to add on that?
We don't do very much in terms of send policy, so I think I'll leave George and Chris's answer there.
Yeah, George.
Oh, sorry, did you mean Caroline?
I mean, sorry, I meant Caroline. Beg your pardon. Yeah.
Similar to Sora, it's not an area that's my speciality.
Yeah.
But I'd agree it's a very, very challenging situation.
Right. I've got one more question here. It's a lot shorter. It seems that recent education policy developments have not been as informed by stakeholders than is desirable or usual. Ministers and officials seem quite closed and unwilling to discuss or consult. Hence, some of the proposals, especially around fees and teaching standards in universities and international student levies to fund maintenance grants, which show arguably a lack of understanding in the system. Would the panel agree about government behaviour in this regard? You know, that they're basically ignoring a lot of the information they're being given. And what is the advice for public affairs professionals in getting in front of policymakers? And I just want to add in there, one of the questions that we didn't have time for was turnover in government ministers, which is one issue I think that is particular in the last government that was particularly pertinent. So how do you get the issue of, you know, international student levies, maintenance grants and related areas to get taken up by MPs? Is their behaviour basically cloth-eared? Caroline, you got a view on that?
Yes, I certainly agree that it gives the impression that some of these policies are being made perhaps by those who don't fully understand the contribution that international students bring. And in the communications that I do on behalf of the departments I represent, I always try and celebrate how our international community really contributes to the excellent research that we do, and that the diversity is one of our key strengths. So that's a core theme throughout all our communications. Perhaps, as you say, as there's so much churn in ministers at the top, one strategy is to target the wider infrastructure around them, so the civil servants, the parliamentary libraries, perhaps host them on campus so that they can see in person how hosting so many international students really contributes to what we do here.
Okay, any more comments to make on that from any of you? I've just got one final one from Jessica Shepherd.
I can just quickly go on.
Yes, quickly. Do you want
I just want to say, yeah, I completely sympathise with the feeling that some announcements feel like they came without any consultation with the sector. We've all seen that in the past, and it is very frustrating to see. I think it's very important to know that there's a limit to what we can achieve through our advocacy work. At the end of the day, ministers are dealing with many competing priorities, and they can't always take into account every single perspective on things, which can be very frustrating. But I think the most useful thing to do is, when you approach policymakers, make it clear that you understand these competing priorities and competing pressures that they're under, and try to be as useful as possible to them given that. And hopefully you'll see the response you want, but I think you also have to be prepared that you're not always going to get what you want out of these things, as painful as it may be.
Right, there's one more question about, and I'll just as to Chris, this is, if I can find it, from Jessica Shepherd, the value of contacting SPADs, special advisors.
Yeah, and so when is it appropriate for an education organisation to email SPADs, and what's the best way to do it? So look, I was SPAD for 5 years, and it was so hard because you were trying to spin so many different plates at the same time. And I would say email is probably not the best way to contact SPADs, actually, because if you think about it, the number of internal government communications that you get, and frankly, most SPADs now work on WhatsApp. So I would say the best thing that you can probably do is to find out where the minister who the SPAD works for is going to speak at an event, or potentially go, find them at party conference or whatever, and just try and sidle up to them and have a conversation. And because I think, generally speaking, face to face is much, much better than trying to do it by email. And just try and arrange to have a coffee or something in the off season, where during the summer when it's a bit quieter, or during the half terms or whatever, when Parliament isn't sitting, when you get more time to put your case across and speak to them. If you have to email it, if there's something time urgent or really pressing, then I would just make the case really clear about what it is you're trying to get across to them. Often SPADs or ministers are just not cited on stuff. So, when we contact SPADs on behalf of businesses and organizations, it's often very short, no more than a paragraph or two, setting out very clearly in the header, you may not be aware of this, but we wanted to let you know that X, and just doing that flagging service to them. Sometimes they're aware of it, sometimes they're not. Sometimes they'll pass you off to civil servants, and sometimes they'll want to have a conversation. If you're in any way politically inclined, that's the other way. Just bear in mind that SPADs do a lot of party work as well. So if you're of the same political persuasion, that can be quite useful. If you're not, that's less so. You might have to rely on colleagues and others. But those are some of the ways that you can do it, and good luck.
Okay, it's now exactly 1:30 now, and I'm just going to scribble down what I think are the main findings from this. Get your message right, number one, and make sure it's short, simple, and something that's relevant to not just politicians but the electorate. Get content onto your own channels, as much as you possibly can. Use a variety of your own channels, but also use a variety of other people's channels. So you've got to be holistic about this. Make sure that you use the media, but don't ignore local media, which is something I found particularly interesting. Build relationships, build coalitions. Don't just contact politicians when you've got a crisis. Do your research. Make sure that you find out what an MP or a Lord or civil servant is interested in. Don't use LinkedIn. And tailor your messages to what the government agenda is at the moment. What are the things that are at the front of their agenda? And I think that's about it. I mean, there's just so much here. I will be writing this up as a blog, and I'll contact you all anyway to just check that I haven't horribly misquoted you. But big thanks to all four of you. And I've just learned an awful lot. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye then.
Thanks, everyone.